right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Jennifer Roberts, and I am here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am one of the two co-leads for the Carter Center's Democracy Initiative here in North Carolina. We call that the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. As you know, the Carter Center has done work overseas, around the world, monitoring elections, supporting democracy, doing peacemaking, and actually helping eradicate diseases as well. This is part of their democracy initiative in the United States. In about 2020, the Carter Center became concerned about the lack of confidence and the number of people worried about fraud and missteps in our election process all over the country. And this initiative is their work to help restore that confidence, to bolster democracy. And as we say, we have for those who are a part of our network, we have sort of a motto that we say. I'm going to read it. We, the members of the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections, have come together out of a shared belief in basic American values. We are Republicans, Democrats, and everyone in between. We are working to build confidence in elections and to promote peaceful political engagement through agreeable disagreement, focusing on what we are for rather than what we are against. Peaceful political engagement requires that we recognize our common humanity first, even if we have differences. We are concerned about rising reports of acts of hate against our fellow Americans. Dehumanization and hatred of others is never the way in a productive, functioning democracy. And I would say also in our human relations with each other. So my partner in this work is Bob Orr, former Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. We have been consulting with the Carter Center since 2021 and continue to grow our network. So if you are interested in joining our network, some of you are coming here for the first time from a faith perspective, but if you want to be part of that broader network, just send me an email. You can also sign up on the website, which is nctrustedelections.org. All right. So let me say again that we have folks here who are joining, mostly from North Carolina, but we have some from other parts of the United States and maybe even, of course, from Northern Ireland. And we welcome everyone. Please remember to stay muted, and we'll have questions from the chat in the second half of our program. Well, we realize in North Carolina that our faith communities also play an important role in supporting our democracy, and that is what brings us here today. I want to take a minute and just thank the partners who have helped spread the word about this event, including the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections, the Carter Center that is funding this initiative, Rethinking Conflict, Gary Mason's organization, MECMIN, which stands for Mecklenburg Metropolitan Interfaith Network, the North Carolina Council of Churches, the Reimagining America Project, and the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. All of those groups, and there are others who have said they would share the invitation and will share the recording when it's done. So I probably miss one of our partners, but we appreciate all of you being here today. And now I am going to get on with our program, what you all came here to listen to, not to listen to me. It is my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who is joining us today from Northern Ireland. He is a Methodist minister who founded and directs the Belfast-based conflict transformation nonprofit called Rethinking Conflict. Previously, he spent 28 years as a Methodist clergy person in Belfast and played a role in the Irish peace process, which we're going to hear more about today. His bio is a lot lengthier than this, but I'm going to do a quick summary. He helped establish the Skanos Project, which is an urban center developed as a model of coexistence and shared space. He has advised Protestant ex-combatants on the civilianization efforts of paramilitaries. He was instrumental in facilitating negotiations with paramilitaries and government officials. In 2007, his contribution was formally recognized by the late Queen Elizabeth. In 2009, his church was the stage from which loyalist paramilitaries announced their weapons decommissioning. Gary Mason has lectured in political, religious, and academic forums throughout Europe, South Africa, the Middle East, and the US on lessons from that Irish peace process. In fact, he tells me he just finished giving a seminar with colleagues in Jerusalem and around the world an hour ago. So we hope your voice is recovered, Gary. He holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Ulster and completed theological studies at Queen's University. He's a senior research fellow at there are too many institutions to name all of them, but there's the Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Ireland. He's an adjunct professor at the Chandler School of Theology at Emory, a faculty advisor and partner at the Negotiation Strategies Institute at Harvard, and he's working with the Carter Center in its Faith Forward Democracy initiative, which, by the way, has been launched in Georgia, Florida, and Arizona as well. So, and believe me, that's not even all. I've left off a lot of others, but Reverend Mason, we are really, really pleased to have you with us this afternoon, this evening. For some of you, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce your special guests. And I want to remind everyone to keep your microphones muted. And as the conversation develops, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Off to you, Gary.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Good to see you again there. Just a couple of things that kind of map out the direction we'll go in tonight. I'm just going to speak for about 10 minutes and bring my colleague in, Alba McGuinness and Mike Nesbitt, and we'll contextualize that as we go along. Jennifer was mentioning I was in parish ministry for 28 years. So primarily I still work in the island of Ireland. We have a good peace agreement, but it still needs work on, even 26 years this coming April after the Good Friday Agreement. I worked pretty extensively in the Middle East and also in the US. The interesting thing is Ireland is post-conflict. Dakota, a colleague and a friend of my good friend Alba McGuinness, John Hume, said we need to get the gun out of Irish politics. And I think we've achieved that painfully, and we're determined to make sure it stays out of Irish politics. So that's post-conflict. Work in the Israeli-Palestinian theater, which is in conflict. Also work in the United States. And I'll be honest and candid, because that's good for all of us tonight. Many of us, observers looking in the United States, are worried, genuinely worried, that the US could spill into conflict. I'm just finishing our seminar there from 6 p.m. my time to 7 p.m. there with the Rossing Center, which is a religious think tank in Jerusalem. And I want to begin this actually with a quotation from a person called Micah Goodman. Micah wrote a book called Catch 67, looking at the 1967 war in the Israeli-Palestinian theater. He was a former advisor to Naftali Bennett, who's the former Prime Minister of Israel before Benjamin Netanyahu. Here's what he said about sectors within the Israeli society. And as I read this, I want you to think, does this sound a little bit like the US? Because to me, it sounds a little bit like what I lived through for 30 years. Micah says this: the right's monopoly on the image of Zionism, the left's monopoly on the image of humanism, and religious society's monopoly on the image of Judaism all hurt Israelis' ability to think about Zionism, humanism, and Judaism objectively. He then says this: when people fail to judge beliefs by their own reasonableness, but instead view them according to the sectarian identity of their adherents, we can conclude that crowd psychology has replaced independent thought. So as a kind of starter, let me just ask a question. We'll answer it, no doubt, when we open it up for conversation. Has crowd psychology within the American political theater replaced independent thought. I was asked to do a lecture 2 years ago, which actually was for the University of Nebraska, but I ended up doing it by Zoom when I was in Atlanta. And the question they asked me to wrestle with was, is religion bad news? And I actually began the lecture by saying, the answer is yes. Because when religion associates itself, I would suggest, with toxic forms, politics, identity, and religion, it most certainly is bad news. I mean, let's not work on the assumption tonight, no matter why you're a Republican or a Democrat, that kind of religious ethnic nationalism is some form of new phenomenon. I mean, Jesus wrestled with this concept 2,000 years ago. I mean, Jesus lived in a space that was under occupation. The word we hear continually as regards the Middle East. In other words, the kind of jackboot of the Roman Empire was on the neck of the Jews. So Jesus knew some of the struggles we had in the context of Irish society that's happening now in the Middle East and that's happening within the United States. And most conflicts invariably have three elements to them. Land, this land is my land, not your land. Identity, my identity, be it theologically or politically, is superior to your identity. And religion, my interpretation of the sacred text is right and yours is wrong. Northern Ireland, the space where my good friends Alban and Mike grew up in along with me, is a tiny, tiny space. Probably definitely doesn't even make the population of a major American city. 1.6 million people during the conflict. We're now hitting about 1.9 million. And over those 30 years, from 69 through to 1998, we had 4,000 deaths, 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 30,000 people through our penal system, with 22,000 armed robberies and 16,000 bombings. I'm often in the United States, as many of you know, and I extrapolate those figures and simply say, if the Northern Irish conflict had have taken place in the Middle East, in the US, over a 30-year period, you would have had 800,000 dead, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, 6 million political prisoners, 4 million armed robberies, and 3 million bombings. So even 26 years after the Good Friday Agreement, myself and my colleagues who are with me tonight, we're still working on our peace process, still trying to bed that down, knowing the hell, the chaos, and the actual mess of what that internal civil war did to this tiny, tiny space. People often ask me, Gary, was it a religious conflict? It wasn't a religious conflict in the sense that we were fighting over ancient texts. So it wasn't just after the Protestant Reformation where you had a counter-Reformation. But I would argue that what I call a form of toxic religion fit into that quite considerably. The late Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi to the British Commonwealth, who sadly died of cancer a few years ago, said this. On one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. Religion has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. Religion has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. So, I mean, let's be honest tonight, people have hated in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. I mean, those are undeniable facts. They're absolutely terrifying. And the great believers of another generation knew this. I mean, Pascal once said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. The name Jonathan Swift, you may remember him when you were a child, as the author of Gulliver's Travels. But Swift was also the Dean of Christ Church, an Anglican church in Dublin. And Swift rightly said, we have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. And the name that many of you will know, C.S. Lewis, who was literally born a mile over my right shoulder here in Belfast, said, I think we must fully face the fact that when Christianity does not make a man very much better, invariably it makes him very much worse. So was religion abused in my space? The answer is categorically yes. I mean, this afternoon I spent some time with people who were involved in political violence in an organization called the Ulster Volunteer Force. Their motto was, for God and Ulster, on the assumption that God is definitely on the side of British Protestants. No doubt Irish Catholics thought the same. Israelis and Palestinians think the same. Republicans and Democrats also think the same. I've often said that politics is temporal. The gospel is eternal. But then I see both Republicans and Democrats getting more excited, more passionate about politics than they do about the actual gospel. And as one writer there in your context recently said, the state of our politics actually reflects the state of our soul. Let me just tell you two stories, and I'm going to bring my colleagues in and we'll begin a dialogue together. A preacher a few weeks ago there from the Republican side on his radio talk show said, perhaps we need a civil war within the United States. I want to say to him, you don't. But I also do want to say this as well, that a friend of mine who works in Washington, D.C. was speaking to a Democrat, not say whether it was in Congress or Senate, but an appointed political position, who said to him, maybe we need a civil war just to get this all over. Mike, Alban, and I lived through an internal civil war. 26 years later, we're still dealing with the implications. And I said to my colleague there in Washington, D.C., when you're talking to your Democrat friend, just remind him, don't say I know his name or anything like that, but just say, look, I was chatting to my colleague Gary there in Belfast and didn't mention your name, but he said this. As long as he realizes that his 14 or 16-year-old daughter may be blown up in a bombing in a shopping mall in Washington, D.C., let's have a civil war. So I'm going to say to you tonight, no matter why you're Republican or Democrat, I don't live in the United States, so I'll not be voting there come November. But in relation to this mentality, we need a civil war is insanity. Absolute insanity. And I think sometimes Americans don't understand this concept of a civil war. This is not Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. It's also not North versus South, where you had a designated number of northern states versus those in the southern states. Alban, Mike, and I will tell you some stories humanly as we go through this. A civil war in the United States means someone in the next street wants to kill you. Not someone in Michigan wants to kill someone in Florida. It's a long drive. Someone 2 streets away wants to take your life. And that's what we had in Belfast. So a civil war means in the United States that you're going to have a series of mini Belfasts scattered all over the United States. And just finally, before I bring Mike and Alban in, Jesus had the opportunity to lead a revolution. I'm not a fan, I confess, of Jesus Christ Superstar. But if you've seen it, there's a scene in it where Simon the Zealot sensed an opportunity and said this. There's over 50,000 screaming love for you. Every one of those 50,000 will do whatever you ask them. Keep them yelling their devotion, but add a touch of hate at Rome. You will rise to a greater power, Jesus. We will win ourselves a home. You'll get the power and the glory forever and ever and ever. Jesus didn't lead a military revolution. In fact, here's what Jesus said. He says, the kingdom is present through my work. That the kingdom of God is defined by love, not anger. The kingdom is bound up with faith, not fear. So interestingly, Jesus refused the temptation of a shortcut to power by playing on prejudice, goading people's grievances, or kindling up fear. He said, I want you to replace anger with love and put faith where people's fears are. I grew up in the context of political and religious chaos in many ways. I just tell this story and then I bring my colleagues Alban and Mike in. I tell the story as a little boy in the 60s, spilling into the 70s. 3 young boys growing up in that divided city of Belfast. 3 ordinary kids. They could have been born in New York, Rio de Janeiro, Vancouver. And 2 of those boys went to religious Sunday school together. Another 2 of those boys went to primary school together, which in our British Irish context is age 4 to age 11. One of those boys is now dead. He was shot in the back in the early 1980s in an internal terrorist feud. The second boy served a life sentence of 18 years, literally slitting someone ear to ear and dumping their body in a back alley in Belfast. I'm the third boy that ends up a Methodist clergy person. And I've been asked 101 times to analyze why I didn't end up pursuing political violence or terrorism. And sometimes it's difficult to answer. These were ordinary kids on both the Catholic side and the Protestant side. I fundamentally disagree with what they did. There's another person I know who's dead a number of years said, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up and said, let's start killing each other. There was a context here that made ordinary people do some awful things. So I want to bring in my colleague Alban and Mike, leading political leaders. You'll have seen Alban's bio and Mike's bio. Alban, leading lawyer in Belfast, was deputy head of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, first Catholic Lord Mayor of Belfast. My colleague Mike Nesbitt, a very successful career in television before making the choice to make a difference in politics. He was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. I've worked extensively with both these gentlemen. They worked in the Middle East with me. So I'm going to ask them the question initially, as people who chose politics but decided not to choose violence. And Mike will tell you a story about something that happened to his family that very easily could have made him take up the gun for revenge, but he didn't. So Alban and Mike, Alban, I'll kick off with you and then to Mike. Why did you choose to pursue politics and not political violence or terrorism? You're on mute there, just Alban, at the moment. Yeah, you're still on mute just at the moment. And
Right.
maybe that's you. Go ahead. Go ahead. That's you.
Okay. First of all, very, very happy to be here this afternoon with our American friends and colleagues, particularly the Carter Center. I have a very great admiration for the work that they've done over many, many years, and for President Carter himself, a wonderful, wonderful man, dedicated to peace. And that peace, I think, stems very much from his religious belief, his Christian faith, which is a wonderful thing, and something which is probably rare in the political arena. But anyway, enough said there. Why did I choose politics? I chose politics because I was inspired by the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, which was at the very end of the 1960s, the early 70s. And that movement was to bring about equal rights for people in Northern Ireland. The Catholic community, nationalist community, felt alienated from the state by way of laws, by way of discrimination, by way of simply being treated as second-class citizens, very much akin to the civil rights movement that took place in the United States around about that time as well. So I was inspired by that, and inspired in particular by a man called John Hume, who became really effectively the leader of the civil rights movement, and also the leader of nationalist thinking within Northern Ireland and throughout Ireland in the 70s and 80s, and right beyond that, right up to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. Why did I choose politics, peaceful, democratic politics, as opposed to violence? First of all, I saw what violence was doing to people. It was destroying people. It wasn't just simply destroying property, but it was destroying the souls of people. It was destroying the community. And in a divided community, which we had in Northern Ireland, the worst thing you could do was to further divide that community. And the violence further divided that community. The violence was not just simply wrong in itself, but that violence, in fact, was undermining political life in Northern Ireland, undermining the quest for peace in Northern Ireland, the quest for a political solution, a quest for a political resolution of all the problems that we had. Now, let me just deal with violence for a moment. I don't believe that people start off saying with an evil intent in relation to violence. I don't believe that they're just psychopathic. I believe that people who embrace violence do so sometimes, not always, but sometimes, for the noblest of reasons as far as they're concerned. They believe that their cause is right, and the way to achieve a just end to that cause is through violence. They see violence as a shortcut to the remedying of an injustice or the resolution of a political problem. And that, of course, is a deceit, because what it does do, once you embark on violence, the violence itself becomes an issue in itself. It takes on a life of its own, and it becomes the issue. And the political issue, the social or economic problems that you are trying to resolve, those problems are forgotten in the vortex of violence. And so violence becomes a problem in itself, and violence really is a dead end. Of course, also, in addition to that, violence destroys people in themselves. It destroys those who perpetrate violence because it corrupts them in their thinking. It also not only disrupts the community and causes problems, further problems within the community, but it also breaks up the community. And so what is a noble end in itself is in fact not achievable, because the violence is the wrong method for achieving that. Of course, violence is wrong in itself, morally, in most circumstances. To use violence is an anti-Christian thing. It's I think it's not just simply anti-Christian, but anti-religious in the real sense of that term, if we look at other religions as well. So for me, the choice of pursuing political justice was through non-violence, through parliamentary means, and I believe that that was much more effective, a much better way of moving on. I involved myself in politics. I became a local councillor in the local city council. I eventually became the Lord Mayor of Belfast. And when I became Lord Mayor of Belfast, and I was the first Catholic or nationalist Lord Mayor of Belfast, my primary task was to reassure those, in particular the Unionist and Protestant population, to reassure them that although I, as a nationalist and a Catholic, member of the SDLP, although I was in charge, that there was no threat to their community, no threat to their political identity, no threat to their religion, no threat to their standing within the community. And so myself and my party embarked on a program of trying to bring the community together, opening up the city hall, opening up politics, and saying that everybody should be involved, and there would be no, as it were, dictatorship by myself or my party in relation to the way things would be done in Belfast. So it was an open situation for everyone, and we welcomed everybody in. Now, that was difficult because people distrusted me and they distrusted my party. But gradually, through doing things in the community and bringing people together and sticking to my word that I would be a Lord Mayor for all, people began to believe me and began to believe that there was that this was a proper way of proceeding. And I think I set down the blueprint or the structure for future Lord Mayors in Belfast to work together to bring the community. And I think that even those who opposed me then in the unionist parties, those who opposed me also in other nationalist parties, particularly Sinn Féin, have adopted that partnership approach. In other words, that we could work together as both communities coming together for the common good, and through partnership, working through that partnership, that we could establish a real peace and establish real goodwill between people, because that's what was lacking, a lack of trust and a lack of goodwill. And I think part of that is not just simply saying violence is a bad thing to do, or politics is a good thing or a better thing to do, but also to use language which is non-threatening, to use language which is reassuring, and to use language which will bring about a bonding of people rather than diminishing people's hopes and desires in the community. And I think that that process has continued on right through up to the Good Friday Agreement, which most people would have at least a vague understanding of. It was an agreement in 1998 to bring the parties together in Northern Ireland to end political violence. And we succeeded in doing that. But could I say this much? The ending of political violence or widespread political violence it was not bringing about peace in itself. It was the start of a process of bringing about peace. You don't just simply arrive at a situation where you end the violence and therefore, ergo, you have got peace. That is not what happens. What you do is you end the violence as substantially as you can, and then you move on to a process of building peace. And that process of building peace still continues today, 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. And that, but part of that is, and I have to stress this, is using language which is non-threatening, language which is not toxic, and in using that language and in accommodating one another in events, in public appearances, in reaching out to the community, taking the unusual steps of going to another community, of talking to people, engaging with people. That is all part of the process of building peace. It is not just simply one particular dramatic act. You have to continue on doing this all the time. So I am convinced that peace is created not just simply through coming together and signing a document, but peace arises out of a dialogue between people on the basis of knowing who they are, building that dialogue between people of different points of view. And in doing that, you actually create a dynamic in itself. And that is very, very important, because that dynamic is organic, and it continues to grow and continues to create an atmosphere, and to creates in itself, I think, a language of peace, which is very, very important for all of us, whether we be in Northern Ireland or Ireland as a whole, in Britain, or indeed in the United States. That language of peace, that language of tolerance, that language of understanding is very, very important and vital to the whole political process. And Gary, is that
Yeah, no,
sufficient?
listen, that's a good starter.
or-
Just to, so we create a context here to create a wider conversation. So that's
Yes, yes.
so Mike, I'll pass over to you, and I think it'd be helpful if you told the story of your father. And I'm sure, being human, revenge crossed your mind. I'm quite happy to say, as a clergy person, it would have crossed mine. So we're in your hands.
Yeah, thank you. And Jennifer, thank you very much to you and your colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity. So my story is a common one, I think, of the conflict we euphemistically call our troubles. So my grandfather established a linen manufacturing business in the centre of Belfast many years ago, handed it over to his two sons, my father and my uncle. And I was being groomed to become the third generation to operate the plant. But that opportunity was denied me on the 25th of January, 1973, when it was blown up by the IRA. And for a number of reasons, it was not possible for the two boys, Dad and Uncle Jack, to get it going again. But the impact on my father was something that struck me very heavily. He was 49 years of age only at the time. And in the moment of the explosion, every certainty in his life disappeared, because, of course, he had been brought up from a very early age to take over from his father. But as certainties disappeared, excuse me, responsibilities remained. He was still married to his wife. He still had 3 young children to look after, a car and a house to run, that whole kind of 9 yards of adult responsibility. But suddenly, there was no income stream. So this was the moment that got me interested in the human cost of conflict and in the politics of Northern Ireland. And I was not long after studying English at university, and I read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, in which he talks about a memorable day in people's lives. And what he means is, it is a day that shapes the rest of your life. And the analogy he uses is that it wraps you in a chain. And if you're lucky, it will be a chain of gold and of roses. But if you're not, it will be iron and thorns. And unfortunately, I think the story of the conflict, of the Troubles, is thousands upon thousands of people who had a memorable day that wrapped them in that chain of iron and thorns. And unfortunately, when they pass away, the thorns and the iron, that chain doesn't disappear. It's actually handed on intergenerationally. So today we're talking about not just children and grandchildren of the person who had the memorable day, it's the great-grandchildren. And we could do more and must do more to intervene and try and break those chains. So in getting interested in the politics of Northern Ireland, I started to study the history of the place. And even as a unionist, I accept that there was a fault line in partitioning the island into 2 separate political states, just over 100 years ago. Because in creating Northern Ireland, the 6 counties in the northeastern corner of the island, you had a huge Protestant unionist majority. And this meant 2 things. The first was, you could have an election to our parliament every month. Unionism was always going to win. And the second thing was, because unionist politicians knew they were always going to win, I don't think they felt any great need to reach out to the likes of Alban and say, come with us on this journey, be our brothers and sisters, and let's create this new country together. And because of that, then I think people from Albans community 100 years ago thought, well, we're not going to bother trying to help create this new country because it's not for us and we're not welcome. So you had this situation where a huge well of frustration built up over the years, which exploded in anger in the late 1960s. And there were two developments. There was the civil rights movement that Alban joined, which to my mind was out to reform the state of Northern Ireland. And then there was the birth of the Provisional IRA, who were basically out to destroy it. And as Gary said, the equivalent in America would have been 800,000 deaths over the next 30 years, which is, by the way, maybe 12 to 15 times your death toll in Vietnam, your biggest conflict since the end of the Second World War. So it's no surprise that we still struggle to deal with the legacy of the conflict. And by the way, at one point, I left broadcasting. I was a news anchor in your terms, helped set up a body called the Commission for Victims and Survivors. And that was about looking at the needs of victims and survivors that we'd never met in terms of lost opportunities in education, employment, in social inclusion, in family life. And Gary talked about 4,000 people being killed. So for each one of those, were there 10, 12, 20 people who were family members and close friends who had stories to tell? And I'll share just two, Jennifer, from my time in the Victims Commission. And Gary referred to this about, people living 2 streets apart trying to kill each other. There is a victim who lost his legs when his taxi was blown up. So he was already a victim when a man that he had known for 60 years from primary school came to see him one day and said, I need to talk to you. So they found somewhere quiet. And this guy said to the man, back in the 1970s, I was given a gun one night and I was told to shoot you dead. And I found you were on the Antrim Road in North Belfast, talking to people on the street corner underneath a lamppost. So I hid in an alleyway and I cursed you. Would you please get this conversation finished so I can get on with murdering you so I can get away? He waited so long, he became very concerned that an army or a police patrol might be passing. So he went home, the gun on fired. He's telling this man this 60 years later. Why is he doing it? Because the putative gunman is now feeling the weight of his own mortality and he wants to confess. But what is he doing? He's passing all that angst to the guy he was supposed to kill. And now this guy is having sleepless nights thinking, how often have I gone out socially with you, had a drink with you, had a laugh with you? And yet, if circumstances had fallen your way, you would have shot me dead 60 years ago. And the other one, and these are just picking them randomly. A woman who was married to a farmer who was shot dead. So she was left with 2 toddlers, 2 very young children, a herd of milking cows, and a farm which included a slurry tank. And as I think we all know, if you get too close to a slurry tank, it's fatal within seconds. So her concern is, how do I keep these 2 toddlers, my 2 children, safe while I milk the cows? There was nobody to help. So what she did was she got 3 old tractor tires and piled them one on top of the other and created a prison cell into which she lifted her 2 toddlers twice a day so she could milk the cows, keeping them safe. I think it's a definition of pathetic. It's also a definition of how the state and the agencies of the state failed to form the wagons in a circle around people who were in need of basic support and help. So this is what got me, really motivated for politics. And the person who I think probably had more impact on me than anybody else wasn't a unionist. It was Albán's old party leader, John Hume. So as a broadcast journalist, I covered a lot of our troubles. Daily news programs where people would come in and talk about the latest atrocity. And by and large, the politicians would verbally sling mud at one another and just say, oh, it's terrible, we are such a divided society, there is no way to resolve this. The exception was John Hume, who wouldn't talk about us being divided. He talked about us being diverse and preached that diversity was the essence of humanity. And if we could accept that, we could then harness it. And if we could harness it, we could create a most wonderful society. And I think that is at the root of the agreement to stop the violence in 1998, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And last May, I had the pleasure to be in the Carter Center and also in the Baker Center in Houston for 2 events to mark the 25th anniversary of the agreement. And I used the opportunity to remind people that while the agreement is a very complex document, talking about all sorts of political institutions, the most important bit to me is page 1, because the first commitment is in a thing called the Declaration of Support, where everybody who signed up pledged themselves to take the opportunity to build new relationships amongst ourselves based on reconciliation, based on tolerance of each other, based on showing each other mutual respect and building trust. And to me, those values are the only firm foundation on which to create a society. And I'll finish, Gary, by saying that in the last number of years, as a unionist leader, I do fear that many unionists are losing their way and are losing their courage to build those bridges, to build those relationships with Albán and with his community, to realize that Northern Ireland is a little postage map on the world stage, a little postage stamp on the world map. It's got Protestants and unionists, nationalists, others, people who don't want to be defined by any of the above. Nobody's going away. Everybody's staying. So we've got to find a way to muddle along together. And if we actually embrace it rather than just tolerate it, who knows what we can achieve.
Well, that's super. So, Jennifer, I think we're probably going to open it up and you're going to moderate just a couple of things, maybe just to contextualize that a little. Jonathan Sachs, who I mentioned earlier, talks about linguistic violence. So violence doesn't have to be physical. Violence can be verbal. And for all of us who are people of faith, we all know we're not just going to be judged when we finally leave planet Earth in relation to our deeds, but in relation to our words. So as I look at the United States as an outsider looking in, the linguistic violence in the United States at the moment on many sides is at record highs. My concern is if you spill into a civil war, and I pray to God you don't, trying to bring that to an end is so, so difficult. I mean, Albert and Mike would confirm with me when we were all a lot younger, British troops come on the streets here in August 1969. Common wisdom of the day was, this will be over by Christmas 1969. It didn't officially finish. I think it was 2005. It was called Operation Motorman. It was the longest military operation in British history. I don't need to remind you guys that Brits have fought a hell of a lot of wars. It was the longest in British history. And Paul Valery said this, and then Jennifer, I'll pass it to you. He said, war is a place where young people who don't know each other and don't hate each other kill each other based on decisions made by old people who know each other and hate each other, but don't kill each other. So, Jennifer, you're going to meander through the chat and guide us for the next 40 minutes or thereabouts, so we're in your hands.
Absolutely. And wow, you have given us quite a lot to think about. The chat has been active. My note taking has been active, and there is so much to learn from your experience. But I also want to remind you, when you talk about the equivalent of 800,000 people dying if we had a similar thing in our Civil War, 1861 to 1865, there were over 600,000 who died. And we were a lot smaller nation in those days. And so that proportion touched everybody. And as somebody put in the chat, that war never really ended. We still have a lot of generational trauma. And one of you talked about that, about the sons and grandsons and granddaughters, and that the difficulty of avoiding a feeling of revenge. And so one of the questions in the chat was, have there been efforts at reparations or atonement of those who were guilty of violence and of those who have been victims? You talked about a commission for victims and survivors. I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Mike, do you want to pick that up initially, and I'll highlight a couple of things, Alvin? I know you will do the same. So, where are we with the past?
The Commission for Victims and Survivors came into being in 2007. The legislation was passed in 2006. And it gave a definition of victims which did not include the dead, on the basis that there was nothing you could do of a practical nature. So the sort of duties of us as commissioners was, for example, to keep under review the impact of legislation on victims and survivors, to keep under review the efficacy of services that were being provided to victims and survivors. Because, for example, we have a free at the point of use health service, which people do not pay for, but you cannot set up a specific service for a particular group of people. It has to be open to all. So I was very keen to do something in terms of trauma, because I think probably the biggest legacy of our troubles is our shocking rates of poor mental health and well-being. Entirely understandable when these traumatic events happen to people. And it took us a while, I think, to get to understand trauma and the fact that it was so widespread. But actually, if you take a map of Northern Ireland and you colour it in with the hotspots of troubles-related incidents over those 30 years, you'll have a certain map with a lot of hotspots in red. If you then take a 2024 map of poor mental health and well-being hotspots, measured by attempted and completed suicides, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, you actually have a match. So the evidence is pretty clear. So the commission was set up to look at all these things. And then a few years ago, there was a sister body set up called the Victims and Survivors Service. So you go to them and you will say, you know, I need money. My physical health is deteriorating because I was shot 30 years ago and it just gets worse and worse. Or, you know, my children or my grandchildren, I can't afford to send them to school, buy uniforms and books. So it's all about those practical things. In terms of reparations for violence, that has remained incredibly controversial. So there was another body that was set up on a time-limited basis called the Consultative Group in the Past. And towards the end of the noughties, they made a report which had a lot of good things in it, but they also recommended that everyone who had lost a loved one should get a set payment. Something that they had done actually in the Republic of Ireland. So they were simply suggesting you replicate that. That never happened because a lot of people said you cannot be giving money to terrorists. And it didn't work. And somebody tried it again recently. So what we have is a kind of piecemeal approach here, where you know, families will go to court. and sue the police, sue the Ministry of Defence, acting on behalf of the army, sue the government, sue this, sue that. And it's very divisive. I say it's extremely piecemeal. And recently, the latest attempt was a new body called the Independent Commission on Reconciliation and Information Recovery. And they're due to come on stream on the 1st of May. And they're going to pick up all the truth and justice issues. However, they are in legislation allowed to give a limited amnesty. They're calling it limited immunity. But in the court of public opinion, it's an amnesty, so you could come forward and say, I committed a certain murder, but if you provide certain information, then that can't be used to prosecute you. Just today, the High Court in Belfast ruled that was in breach of the European Convention of Human Rights and in no way would promote reconciliation. So the British government will almost certainly appeal that, and it will go through a series of courts up to our Supreme Court. This could take another 2-3 years. I mean, Albin's the legal expert. But it means that people who've been waiting up to 50 years for truth and justice are going to have to wait even longer. And the inevitable consequence is some of them will die. But to use the Dickens analogy, the chain will be passed on. And the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren are even more passionate about seeing truth and justice than their predecessors, I would suggest.
Albin, do you want to just highlight that something in that? Take another question.
Yeah, I think that what's required in a post-conflict situation is a healing process, and that healing process is not just a political healing process, but also a process for healing the wounds within society, between communities, within communities. And some of the things that Mike has just outlined, and he's an expert in this field in terms of dealing with victims, some of those things have been very, very good. And some have not been as good as they should have been. But I think what's important is that people, if they can get justice, if they can get somebody into court who has committed murder or some other crime against their family or any other member of the community, that should be facilitated, and that should be facilitated as best as possible in the circumstances, given this, given the elapse of time. But I think more important almost, well, perhaps not as important, but of equal importance, is the need for victims to know the truth. I know of people that have suffered the death of loved ones, and they're not really interested in people being prosecuted, but they want to know, why was their father, their mother, their brother, their sister, their uncle, whatever, why were they picked out? Why were they victimized by a paramilitary group, or indeed by state forces? And so it's very important that people are allowed to access the truth. And I think one of the dangerous things that we've got at the moment is that recent legislation is now ruling out inquests into the deaths of people. And that, I believe, blocks the opportunity for people to get at the very truth of what happened to their loved ones. And very important that that families are able to do that, because otherwise they will continue on to have a bitterness, a sense of injustice, that their loved one has been treated differently from others in society. So that is very, very important to satisfy the needs of victims and their families, their surviving relatives. But could I say that what is more important than anything else is that the opportunity is given for people to reconcile, one to the other, that there is a process of forgiveness in the middle of all of this, that people can say, well, I know what happened, and now I want to say, I now accept what happened. Obviously, I'm deeply hurt and so forth, but I want to forgive those people that perpetrated this in the interests of the common good, in the interests of creating something better and more decent here, in the interests of creating reconciliation between two communities that have been in conflict with one another. And that is so, so important for the future of our society. We cannot go in to the future in a situation where, in fact, there are these unresolved issues and where there isn't a genuine sense of reconciliation, that people are just simply in institutions, coexisting within institutions, but not actually embracing one another in the spirit of reconciliation, in the spirit of goodwill. So that's the healing process that needs to take place within any post-conflict society, whether it be in Northern Ireland or anywhere else in the world, including the United States of America. And I was quite interested in the remark that somebody made that, you know, the problems of the American Civil War have not been fully addressed. I don't know the truth or other to that, but it's a very interesting question that has been posed. But if that is true, and if there are outstanding issues, then society has got to try and deal with them, and society has got to create a healing process within the United States to bind the wounds that have been caused by that great tragedy, and indeed other things that have happened since then that perhaps have caused other wounds within society. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much to all of you. There are a number of great questions in the chat, but I just want to point out that that truth is so important, truth telling, revealing what actually happened, who actually was harmed. There are a number of truth and reconciliation commissions across the United States right now that are examining the generational trauma that has come from our history of slavery and Jim Crow and bias and bigotry and lynchings and all the terrible parts of our history that we are trying to uncover. And it's unfortunate that your judiciary has put a halt on the truth finding. We share your frustrations with legislation that gets batted back and forth between legislators and judiciaries. We have a lot that is taking its process and its time as well in the US. Someone in the chat also pointed out the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa that was so impactful and effective. So that is definitely a learning. I want to bring a question forward that goes back to the harmful language and the violence infused language, because we know that our media now is surviving based on clickbait and based on the ability to draw readers and viewers and to get reposted, et cetera. And so the question from the chat is, because of the level of rhetorical violence in the US, what lessons have you learned in Northern Ireland about how to tone down the rhetoric? Who has been a leader in this effort? Has the media been a partner, even if unwilling? How have you tried to counter that?
And I think, Jennifer, for yourselves, I mean, I think, you know, religious leaders on both sides, I mean, obviously people are Republican and Democrat. I was in Nashville, as you know, June last year, speaking at a conference. And I mean, there was some very skilled people in that room. It was some of the key communications people from across the United States of major corporations. And I was doing a seminar with a colleague in the Middle East, and probably a number of them come up to me, both Republican and Democrat. And they said, Gary, what should we do as business people? And I mean, I simply said to them, if I was in your position, I would take out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New York Post, saying, politically, we are on different pages as Republicans and Democrats. They acknowledge that initially. But we both, as these two constituencies, we both love this country. We don't want to see it spilling into a civil war. Because if it does, as business people are concerned, the economy is going to go, as well as the loss of life. I think religious leaders should be doing the same. I think both evangelicals and progressives should be saying exactly the same thing. I mean, evangelicals and progressives are not going to agree on LGBTQ. They're not going to agree on women's reproductive rights. That's a given. That's fine. But surely evangelicals and progressives can agree on the fact we want to preserve life. We want to save life. So is there something that those constituencies could unite on and be more in the public space? My concern about the US, and I mean, look, I've been to the US over 100 times. I mean, I've been to 35 states. I know it reasonably well. It's almost as if the church, to my mind, is hiding behind fortress doors and not spilling into the public space to make a difference. Like breathing the kind of rarefied atmosphere of church and not spilling out into that actual space. I mean, just with the quotation here, Mark Twain, where he said, it's curious that physical courage should be so common in the world and moral courage so rare. So I'd be asking folk on this tonight, no matter what your religious background, be you Republican, be you Democrat. And I mean, to me, it's quite interesting. I mean, you know, Jennifer, I've said this before. When I'm in the US, I'm staying with both Republican and Democrat families. And you know what? Most of them are pretty normal. They really are very normal. So they are. And I mean, the classic example of that is if you're bored this afternoon before you go to sleep, read Jonathan Haidt, who is an atheist. So as a clergy person, I'm recommending you read Jonathan Haidt as an atheist, who's written an article called Why Has America Been So Uniquely Stupid in the Last 10 Years? So it's in the Atlantic. So read it. He does that. Now, interesting, he's an atheist, and he starts with the Torah Babel. You're talking about language, confusing language. So you have an atheist quoting from Genesis and the Torah Babel, but he does this survey called the Hidden Tribes, which I'm sure a number of you must be aware of. So here's the Hidden Tribes. Looking at social media, it'll be the curse of the 20th and 21st century. And he says this, 8% of Republicans are responsible for 56% of social media posts. Those on the hard right, okay, Democrats are worse. 10% of Democrats involved in social media are responsible for 70% of social media posts on the hard left. But you know what they have in common? They're all rich and they're all white. So why is the church, and social media irritates me, Jennifer, no end of times, but why are people, more moderate-minded Republicans and Democrats, not spilling into that space? It's not going to go away. So we can ignore it, but a lot of people are getting their information from that space. So suppose I'm asking is, how do people of faith spill more into the public square to have these conversations? Because most of us tonight believe in this, but there's a lot don't. So how do you create a critical mass to widen this conversation? So I'm just throwing that out as a challenge more than anything else. What does that look like? I mean, I'd be interested to hear from some folk within the US. I mean, you know that demographics, you know the constituency, sociologically, theologically, philosophically, psychologically than I do. What comes out of this North Carolina lunch? That's what I want to be asking tonight. Or we're just going to end up in an echo chamber. So how do you make a difference? I mean, to use Jesus' analogy, how do you rub salt into the carcass of a putrefying society? What does that look like in the Carolinas?
And you have brought us back to the role of faith
Yeah.
and faith leaders, and actually every single individual who, as you said, most people in America are moderates and are not on the extreme left or extreme right, and yet they aren't as loud. And where is that moral obligation and that faith obligation to have that moral courage? Of course, we're a project of the Carter Center, and I do think of President Carter and how his faith and morality guided so much of his policy, but in the post-presidency time, especially because he didn't have the back and forth legislatures and judiciaries. But there's another great question about toxic religion and how can society rebuild public space where reciprocal love can be practiced, and how can we do that? And in North Carolina and in the United States, how can we get past the toxic part of faith and build the reciprocal love and build the respect and build the agreeable disagreeing? And I think you would say that's up to all of us.
Yeah. I think as well, see, I've been looking as an outsider looking in, and this space is not perfect by no means, but the kind of rise of in your space of what you call Christian nationalism in relation to that. I mean, Christianity is about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Christian nationalism, to my mind, has borrowed certain motifs of Christianity for a political ideology, which is not Christian. So, Alban, you were going to come in there.
Well, I hope this doesn't jar with anybody, but Seamus Heaney, a great poet, Irish poet, in one of his poems, he was talking about communication between people, particularly within Northern Ireland. And what he was really saying in his poem was, people are very polite in Northern Ireland. They don't want to give offense to their neighbors by talking about things that might be contentious. So you get people meeting in the street, and one may be a Protestant, the other may be a Catholic, and they'd spend 10 minutes talking about the weather, right? But they wouldn't talk about what happened last night or the night before, or what was currently difficult for people to understand in terms of political difference. And what he said in one of his poems, very sarcastically, was, whatever you say nothing. Whatever you say nothing. And the problem there is that many Christians, I think, say to themselves, well, I don't want to give offense to other people, therefore I will restrain myself. I will not actually talk frankly to people. Now, talking frankly, I think people should talk frankly to one another, but you do it in a respectful fashion. You do it by acknowledging difference and saying that that difference is good, but it also must be addressed, and that we must try to use a language which accommodates difference. And I think that's what the Christian should be striving for. In other words, you don't headbutt somebody with your words or with your conversation. But on the other hand, you don't ignore the realities of life, and you don't ignore those issues which are contentious and which give grief to your neighbor. So I think that's very important. Also, it's not just language that is important. Respectful language, using language which can accommodate difference, but also in your actions, that your actions aren't alienating from the other community or the other party or the other side, whatever way you want to put it. In other words, that your actions do not provoke other people. And more positively, that your actions actually try to cement friendship and goodwill. And recently, we've had a new administration here in Northern Ireland, a new executive. And one of the striking things that has come across is the first and deputy first ministers are going to joint events, whether they be sporting events or visiting communities and looking at the work that they're doing and so forth. Those actions, those public actions, together in concert and in harmony, make an impact on people, because they say, well, here's these two who are politically different from one another, politically opposed to one another, doing things together, and that creates goodwill. And I applaud that. I think that that should be done again, until it becomes, just natural that be done. But so common actions are as important as using respectful, frank language.
I would say that we share here in North Carolina the same politeness.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up in Charlotte, we never talked religion or politics at the table because we didn't want to create a ruckus, which meant that you didn't get the tools to have agreeable disagreements. And I think that's someone in the chat mentioned, how do we create that safe public space to do that? We have some organizations who have joined us today, like Mecklenburg Interfaith Ministries, like the Reimagining America Project, who are trying to create that public space and are trying to give people that moral courage to be willing to both confess the past transgressions of either your community or your ancestors, but then also on the other side for that forgiveness, which is, it's based in faith, but is incredibly, incredibly difficult. So there's so many trains to fall here. How do you get, so there's also a question about even within our own families and our own communities, how have you worked to get people who are not willing to show up together or to come to the table? How have you been able to reach out to them? Or, is there a good story there? And I will say one thing before you answer that, and that is in that modeling and showing up together, we have tried to do that here with the North Carolina Network, because Bob Orr is on the right side of the aisle, I'm on the left side, and we have done a lot of conversations. We've done a lot of panels about elections and democracy together, and trying to model that in the town halls that we've had. We always try to have people on the right and the left and finding that common ground. But how have you worked to get people to the table who are reluctant to come?
If I may take that first, Jennifer, I think I would point to probably one of the greatest Americans of your generation, which was Senator George Mitchell, who was the man who chaired the talks that led to the 1998 agreement. And his starting position was, we will not list all the areas of disagreement that we need to resolve. We will start by focusing on our common humanity and where we have agreement. And by doing that, you both shrink the problem because you're banking things you agree with, and also you're building momentum and confidence. And I think that's the way to do it, because you'll never rule out or eliminate disagreement. That is part of the human condition. And I know on the chat, I thought I saw there was a question about ending rhetorical violence. And in Northern Ireland, politically, we've gone a long way. I think the good news is, for example, we have 90 members of our Legislative Assembly. I would say there is only one out of 90, who regularly enjoys using rhetorical violence. There are probably others who would like to, but they're members of large parties, and they are controlled, I think, by forces such as they want to keep their seat and their salary and whatnot, so they bide their tongue, to use a local expression. The downside is social media, where rhetorical violence is just, well, last night, for example, there was an international soccer match to which our two main politicians went. Michelle O'Neill, the First Minister, the Republican Sinn Féin politician. She'd never been to this venue before because it was perceived to be British. She had to stand for the British national anthem. But afterwards, she's photographed with the Deputy First Minister, the Unionist, Emma Little Pengelly. And there was a lovely photograph of maybe a 10-year-old fan taking a selfie of himself and the two ministers. And I just put it on X or Twitter with, "I like that." Two of the first comments were incredibly negative. The first was, "Oh, you would, wouldn't you?" And the second was referring to Michelle's family and their part in the Troubles. So that is the modern era. That kind of rhetorical violence is going to be around for the rest of my lifetime. And an interesting question is, would the 1998 agreement have been achieved with social media able to give live running commentary on some very delicate talks? If I may, because I know we're time's running out a little bit, a couple of other concepts I'd like to touch on. Reconciliation is one. I know there's a definition in the dictionary, but I don't think politically in Northern Ireland we have an agreed definition of what reconciliation means. And to my mind, it happens in here first, in your own mind. I have reconciled myself to the memorable day and what happened to my father. And I think that allows me to go and engage with people who think differently from me. But I could take it to victims who think reconciliation means you want me to go and hug the person who murdered my loved one. So we've got a lot of work to do in reconciliation. One definition, by the way, that just tickles me, I like it because it's challenging. Reconciliation is giving up all hope of creating a better past, which is what some people want to do. They just want the memorable day to be written out of their history. And Alban mentioned the greater good, and we only got the agreement in '98 because leaders like John Hume and David Trimble understood the concept of the greater good. In other words, the interests of the people had to come first, ahead of your party political instincts and ahead of your personal ambitions. And without that sequencing, without putting the people first, we wouldn't have had an agreement 26 years ago.
No, that's helpful, Mike. I mean, yeah, on the reconciliation thing there, Jen, one of the best quotations I've read is that reconciliation is no cheap matter. It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences. Reconciliation presupposes confrontation. I would say managed confrontation, but I think there has to be an honesty. And I think sometimes, you know, in our context, you know, and I'm not knocking my fellow clergy, but the assumption was if you just get Catholics and Protestants into the same church worshiping together, all will be well. Well, all wasn't well because people were killing each other in the streets. And that's why the church had to be in the marketplace. And I just think within the US, the church also needs to be in the marketplace. I mean, Bret Stephens, the New York Times journalist, has a brilliant quotation, which Mike and Alban know because I use it a lot at a dialogue group we have. And he says, in order to disagree well, you first must understand well. You have to read deeply, listen carefully, watch closely. You need to grant your adversary moral respect, give them the intellectual benefit of doubt, have sympathy for their motives, participate empathetically with their line of reasoning, and you need to allow for the possibility that you might yet be persuaded of what they have to say. So,
just Could I just say, Gary, that I think people think that reconciliation is a soft option, as a happy clappy situation. It's not. It's a tough process, and it is a process. Very important. It's not an event in itself. It might be a series of events, such as the two top politicians going to a football match together, but it's a whole series of things that then creates a space in which people feel comfortable to discuss things which do actually divide them and seriously divide them, but reach a suitable understanding of those divisions.
Well,
do you
we could
kind-
go on for another hour, I think. But I know that it's approaching 9:30 your time in Northern Ireland, and we promised folks would be done in 90 minutes. We have learned so much. We have learned that language matters. It is important. Relationship and dialogue are incredibly important. The imagining, I think, Gary, what you started with, that if you want to revert to civil war, as long as your 16-year-old daughter might get caught in a bomb, that reality check, the imagining of the horrors of that kind of violence, the long-term process, that we cannot be hasty. We have to look at this as a marathon. And then I think also the fact that each one of us can play a role, and we can bring our faith to the table. Faith leaders should not be afraid to talk about civics, because if we, as you say, leave it behind the closed doors and don't live our faith in our communities, we are going to miss a lot of that moral courage. I want to tell folks, some of the folks who joined are not on our regular network list. If you do want to be on the Faith Forward Democracy Initiative for North Carolina, please send either me or Rachel or Bob an email and say you want to be joining this and have more of these conversations, bring some of these things to your own communities across North Carolina. I want to also acknowledge my partner in this, Bob Orr, who I'm going to give a whole minute to say hello and acknowledge. Sorry, Bob, I talk too much, but I want to make sure people know that Bob has also contributed a great deal to this and has been very important in this dialogue. Bob, I want to say a few things.
Let me thank Gary, Mike, and Adrian for their time and participation in this. I had an opportunity to go to Belfast a few years back, and it was really an eye-opening experience for me. And I am eternally grateful for the kind of leadership you gentlemen and others have exhibited in your country, but also in bringing a positive message to those of us in North Carolina and around the United States. And we appreciate it. I do think there were a lot of takeaways from this conversation, but figuring out how we can get the clergy on both the left and the right in our state to come together to preach a message of unity and respect would be a huge challenge. I think what you've said about the reluctance to get out front on these kinds of issues is eye-opening. But the people of Northern Ireland are in our thoughts and in our prayers, and we appreciate again the leadership and courage that you gentlemen have exhibited, and we thank you for being a part of this.
Very well said. And we are incredibly grateful. Again, reach out if you want to continue this conversation. I know we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, but you folks in Northern Ireland, we are thinking of you and appreciating your leadership. And Gary, you have been doing this all over the world. And we still have a lot of work to do as humans to give grace to each other and to understand that we can get along and agree to disagree, and we can support our democracy. So thank you all. And everybody have a good rest of your day. And this recording will be available, and we'll send it to everybody after it gets loaded to YouTube.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being